Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Tom. Master Doctor, thank you very much. Dr. Cho, Dr. Chung, thank you all for coming, and thank you for inviting me to give this lecture. So we will do, is this on? Yes, it is. Okay. I wasn't sure I was speaking loud enough, but I think they will turn the volume up if I don't speak loud enough. So now we have a lot to get through. We have 1,500 years of Korean ceramics to try to survey. We will hit high points, but try to do some of the details along the way. But given that we have 1,500 years to get through, let's jump right in. Now, I think for this crowd, very little introduction is needed to geography, but if there was anyone in the audience who is experiencing Korea for the first time, so to speak, Korea, of course, is in Northeast Asia. It's a peninsula. The red line that you see bisecting the map there is the 38th parallel, which before 1945 had little significance, but since 1945, it has been the dividing line between North Korea and South Korea. If you're wondering how this relates to the United States in terms of weather, geography, things like that, the 38th parallel there in the United States on the East Coast runs near Charlottesville, Virginia. In the Midwest, it runs more or less through northern Oklahoma. And on the West Coast, through San Francisco. So the weather is a little bit similar to that part of the country. We'll see several more maps. Here is the chronology. When we think of Korea, fortunately, we're dealing with a relatively short chronology, unlike the list of Chinese dynasties, which can go on and on and on. But Korea's is relatively short. We will look at 4 basic periods. We will look at the Three Kingdoms period, this initial formative period of stoneware when the ceramic foundations are laid. Look at the Unified Silla dynasty, when Korea was unified governmentally and politically for the very first time. Then the Koryō dynasty, which is more or less contemporaneous with China's Song and Yuan dynasties, and we see the production of the magnificent Celadon wares. Then the Chosun Dynasty is the last of Korea's royal dynasties, contemporaneous basically with the Ming and Qing dynasties in China, and it saw the production of Buncheong ware, which we'll explain a little later on, but also the production of porcelain, including blue and white porcelain. So that's a little overview of what we'll be doing. Now, as I mentioned, the first period that we look at is the Three Kingdoms period. Excuse me, I hit the advance. The Three Kingdoms period, when the peninsula was divided into 3 basic kingdoms. The Silla in the southeast, Baekje in the southwest, and Goryeo, which occupies much of North Korea today, but also part of what is China today. Then, this little pie-shaped wedge down there is Koryō. It was a confederacy rather than a true kingdom, but in some ways it might be considered the 4th kingdom of the Three Kingdoms period. But there were 3 kingdoms and 1 confederacy. So we'll begin by looking at ceramics from the Three Kingdoms period. Basically, we will concentrate on ceramics from the Silla and Koryō kingdoms, as marked there on the map. More of those are known than from the other kingdoms, but also they produced some of the most advanced wares. Now, these are large tombs in the Gyeongju area. Gyeongju was the ancient capital of Silla, there in the southeast. It is to Korea what Kyoto and Nara are to Japan. Of course, these are royal tombs, and not everything that we have comes from royal tombs. It's just to say that many of the kinds of things that we see from early Korea, particularly from the 5th and 6th centuries, came from tombs. If not from royal tombs, then from less exalted tombs in Korea. Another view with lots of royal tombs there in Gyeongju. These are, as royal tombs, have not been excavated. One of them has, the famous flying horse tomb, but shows you what they look like. Now, this is a series of archaeological excavations done in the 1950s, just to show you how different conditions were at that time. And the reason that fellow there, Kim Jae-won, is circled, he was my first teacher about Korean art. When I was in the Peace Corps in Korea in the 1960s, Kim Jae-won was the longtime director of the National Museum of Korea. I was very young, but he took me under his wing, took me frequently into the storerooms of the National Museum, and that's when I began to make my acquaintance with Korean art. His daughter today, Kim Young-na, is director of the National Museum. Now, this shows a burial in process of excavation, and it shows that many of the ceramics from the Three Kingdoms period, particularly Silla, that we'll see in slides, were recovered in situations like this. They were put in tombs with offerings, probably offerings of food, water, wine, things like that, to nourish the spirit of the deceased. We don't know, of course, the ceramics that we have largely have been recovered from tombs, but probably many of the same types of ceramics were made for use by the living. But this shows how they look when they're being excavated. Or here's another group of pots. These are large jars, for example, that are also being excavated. So this is not an archaeological talk, but it's just to show you the way in which these were discovered and the circumstances from which they've been excavated. Or here's another one where you can see many times things of similar size, similar shape were put together. Now, veering away just a little bit to give the tenor of each period. During the Three Kingdoms period, particularly in Silla, it was a very wealthy, very powerful kingdom, and they had access to a great deal of gold, such that with the Silla kingdom, Koryå to some extent, we have gold crowns. There's gold jewelry of various types. They're also using jade. For the most part, it's not the nephrite that we associate with China in this period, but it's jadeite, probably native to Korea. But this is sort of sets the tenor of the age. Very rich use of gold and such. Or this is a ceremonial belt with various kinds of pendants hanging down from the belt. These occur in silver, they occur in bronze, probably the different metals relating to the different rank of the wearer. Of course, they're ceremonial. And then, of course, there were elaborate earrings that were used by royalty, probably by members of the aristocracy and the wealthy as well. Some of you perhaps saw the wonderful Silla exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum a couple of years ago, in which some of these were featured. Of course, the ring up there, oops, I keep doing that. The ring there is hollow, but look at the beadwork, if you will, where they have affixed metallurgically beads to the surface of the gold. They were very, very accomplished gold workers. But in addition, there were vessels in gold, in silver, and in bronze. And of course, the vessels that we see in those metals relate closely to the vessels that were produced in ceramic ware. In many cases, the vessels in ceramic ware imitate the form and function of those in metal. So notice that it's a dish-shaped bowl. Keep doing that again. The dish-shaped bowl with what we call a pedestal foot or a pedestal base, typically with openwork designs, as we see there. And in many cases, there were the little heart-shaped bangles suspended from the rim of the piece. Buddhism entered Korea into this period. Buddhism reached Korea, different parts in different periods, of course, but basically it was introduced in the 4th century. And by the 7th century, when this magnificent bodhisattva was produced, it was the religion of the peninsula, basically, with a very accomplished sculptural tradition, as you see here. So that more or less sets the background. As we talk about ceramics, I would emphasize that the ceramics are stoneware. Stoneware it's a technical term, indicating the use of a particular type of clay and firing temperature. The next slide, if I remember correctly, yes, is a series of definitions, which I will give you very quickly and you can assimilate later. The first kind of ceramic ware to develop in any civilization is earthenware. It uses relatively humble clays. It's fired in the range of 800 to 900 degrees centigrade. All of you are familiar with earthenware, whether you realize it or not. It is the basic fabric of a terracotta flower pot that you might have for a growing plant at home. You'll notice if you overwater the plant, the pot becomes moist to the touch because the earthenware is porous. Now, stoneware, it uses more sophisticated clays, and it's fired in the range of 1100 to 1200 degrees centigrade. This is not just an arbitrary leap up in temperature. Rather, at that higher temperature, the particles of quartz or silica in the clay begin to melt and to fuse together so that stoneware is impervious to liquids even without a glaze. Now, stoneware is difficult to produce. That is to say, it takes very sophisticated kiln technology to reach the temperatures necessary to fire stoneware. In that context, I would emphasize that a particular culture's level of sophistication in producing ceramics, high-fired ceramics, is a general mirror of that civilization's level of technological advancement. To put things in perspective, the Chinese were the first in the world to produce stoneware, already, say, 1500 BC. The Koreans were the next in the world to produce stoneware, beginning in the 5th and 6th centuries AD. The Japanese followed suit, learning from the Koreans, and then gradually to the rest of the world. But it means that China, as we know, was one of the world's technological leaders for many centuries, but the Koreans were also very high on that scale of technological advancement. Porcelain we'll come to later, but porcelain uses two very specific clays that when fired together produce a white, translucent ceramic ware. Porcelain tends to be fired in the realm of 1300 to 1400 degrees centigrade. And once again, putting things, world ceramics, world civilizations in context, the Chinese first produced porcelain in the 8th or 9th century. The Koreans in the 11th century, the Japanese in the 17th century, the Europeans in the 18th century, and the poor old Americans in the 19th century. So when we put things in this kind of perspective, we begin to get an idea about levels of technological advancement and how things have changed throughout the world. The West's rise to technological sophistication really begins with the Renaissance. Sudden advancements there with the development of science, with the development of technology, and so its rise to preeminence is a relatively recent phenomenon. Things might have been different in the West if the Roman traditions had continued. Rome had not fell, but Rome did fall, and things changed a lot. So the way things eventuated, China was the leader, but with Korea very close behind. So these ceramics, these stonewares from the 5th and 6th centuries, even though they're not glazed, and even though they might look humble, keep in mind that the operative word is look. They are very sophisticated because they are high-fired wares. Only the Chinese and the Koreans at this time could produce high-fired wares of any people in the world. And they reflect that high degree of technological sophistication. So you see the bowl here, sometimes referred to as a pedestal bowl. It imitates the form of the gold bowl that we saw before. It has the cover, it has the pedestal base with the open work designs. Often there will be a little bit of decoration. Usually the decoration is abstract geometric decoration, as you see there, that was combed into the wet clay before it was fired. Here is another one. These are gray stonewares, typically light gray, but often in the kiln they will assume a dark skin, if you will, because of the carbon in the smoke flowing through the chamber where the ceramics are being fired. Were you to see a chip, and thank heavens this one is not chipped, but were you to see a chip, you would see that the basic fabric, the basic stoneware, is a very light gray. The dark color that you see is just a skin on the surface. Some places will have, that is places of manufacture, will have square or rectangular openings in the pedestal base. Others will have elongated triangles, as you see here. They give a lot of indication as to where the piece was produced. The ones with the elongated triangles tend to be produced in the Kaya Confederacy. Those with squares, particularly squares or rectangles in two registers that alternate in checkerboard fashion, tend to be produced in Silla, in the Gyeongju area. Once again, limited decoration, a little bit of comb design there, but look at that wonderful handle, like a fiddlehead fern, something like that. Quite delightful forms. Again, the jars, even the jars have the pedestal bases with open work and a little bit of geometric decoration over the surface. Occasionally, but very rarely, there will be some pictorial decoration, as you see here. And when there is pictorial decoration, it typically is horses, as we see here. Occasionally, there might be some little modeled figures placed on the shoulder, but typically horses that are incised, as we see there. Some of the most interesting pieces are these pouring vessels. They're very rare, but they're quite interesting. This one in the form of a dragon. You have it's a very small piece, just about 5 inches in height. This is the body or the container portion. This, like a funnel, is the device where the contents would be put into the vessel. And then, of course, the elongated spout here, through which the contents would be dispersed. But it's done in the form of a dragon, so that you have the wonderful neck here and the mouth, the head with the open mouth and the tongue coming out there, and then the spikes along the spine and the tail here. Note that there is a pedestal base. It's perforated with square openings, and as influenced by some of the metalwork pieces, it has the little bangles there. Now, you look at something like this, and you realize, of course, that there is influence from the Chinese tradition. Of course, there had been influence in making stoneware itself, the technical influence. But although this might look like a Chinese tomb figurine, it is not. That is to say, Chinese tomb figurines are simply sculptures. They are hollow. If you look under the base of a Chinese tomb figurine, it will be open and hollow. This, by contrast, is a container. Just like the previous dragon-shaped container. It is hollow, of course, but the underside is closed. It has the same funnel type of apparatus there for putting contents into the piece, and then it has the pointed spout there for dispensing the contents when needed. Of course, the horse is decked out in armor, and you have a young warrior of the type known as hwarang riding the horse there. So one thing that I would point out is that something that you will see in the continuum of Korean ceramics throughout the development is that when possible, more so than in China, there is a taste for vessels of sculptural form. And you're seeing that tradition established already here. In addition, when possible, there is a taste for open work designs, which you don't see here, but you see in the pedestal bases and this and that. It will pop up in celadons, it will pop up in Chosën porcelains and such. It's not that others can't do it, like the Chinese, it's simply that the Koreans have a more pronounced taste for those characteristics. Now, of course, another one of the great marvels of Three Kingdoms period, in particular Silla ceramics, are these stands. It's a ceremonial stand and probably a round-bottomed jar for an offering, perhaps of water, perhaps of wine, something like that, would have been placed on it. They're certainly turned up in tombs, but they may have been used in ceremonies honoring the living as well. With something like that, it's hollow. It is perforated in all sorts of ways, as you see there. And when we talk about the use of a small round-bottomed jar, here is a stand and jar set that is more or less complete. A very large jar, which would be very heavy and possibly too heavy for the stand to support, would be supported on a stand that looks more like a bowl. But here you see little bits of natural ash glaze, sometimes referred to as kiln gloss. It's not intentional. It's formed when bits of ash in the smoke from the fire that goes through the kiln to heat the ceramics falls on the pieces and causes a little bit of glaze to form naturally and accidentally, as you can see around the shoulder of the little jar most easily. Now, these are quite amazing. This stand, for example, is about 3 feet tall, perhaps even 3.5 feet tall. They're not small. They are stoneware. They're fired at a very high temperature, as you know. And what's most amazing is in something like this is that the stand is perfectly straight. When you're dealing with something this heavy and at that high temperature, there's always the possibility that it will warp, that it will slump, that will just collapse. It speaks to the mastery of clay. It also speaks to the mastery of the kiln to be able to control the temperature and to know exactly how long to fire the piece. So something like this is not only quite striking from an aesthetic point of view, but it's quite a technical marvel and really symbolizes the finesse that they had mastered. We saw that. Now, we're leaving behind the Three Kingdoms period. We're going to move into the Unified Silla period. One by one, Silla conquered Baekje. Well, first it absorbed Kaya, conquered Baekje, and in 668, through an alliance with Tang Dynasty China, it conquered Koryō, which was the kingdom in the north, which was very strong militarily, but Silla was able to conquer it. And in conquering it, for the first time, it unified in 668, it unified the peninsula militarily and governmentally. The capital stayed in the southeast at what is modern Gyeongju, right there. Of course, Unified Silla is basically contemporaneous with the Tang Dynasty in China. It runs, that is Unified Silla from 668 until 935. Again, just to set the context, this is the great temple of Pulguksa. It's on the UNESCO's World Heritage Monuments, a royal temple, of course, that was constructed in the middle of the 8th century. It has these wonderful bridges that go up, stair steps and bridges that were for use by the royal party only, but one of the great monuments of Unified Silla architecture. And it reminds us that Buddhism, by the Unified Silla period, had become the state religion of Korea, so that you had all kinds of state-sponsored temples and sculptures and such. This is nearby. This is the great cave temple of Saccharum, not too far from Pulguksa that we just saw. It's unlike the cave temples in India, Central Asia, or China, it's not hollowed into the living rock. The reason for that, the cave temples in India, China, and such are hollowed into relatively soft rock. They're hollowed into limestone, sandstone, or at Dunhuang in Gansu province, into clay. There are no such hills in Korea. The hills in Korea are granite. It would be virtually impossible to hollow a cave temple into granite. So what they did, they built it of cut blocks of stone in imitation of a natural cave temple. Really very, very sophisticated work. And the sculpture that you see here, again, it reflects the Tang style, but it is absolutely magnificent. This temple. Of course, the Buddhist sculpture in general of the Unified Silla period is beautiful, it's serene, it has these wonderful rounded forms, but also characteristic of the period, the Unified Silla, the wonderful work with open work that you see in the mandala or full body halo behind the Buddha. Now, looking at ceramics, we'll just look at a few from the Unified Silla period. They continue to be stonewares. For the most part, they are unglazed, but of course, there will be a little bit of kiln gloss that you see there. But notice what's beginning to happen. We're beginning to have vessels that are full and round. The pedestal base is becoming very small, and the openings are becoming vestigial rather than emphatic, as we saw in ceramics from the earlier period. Or you look at something like this, which is imitating a Chinese form with the so-called dished mouth, and you realize that the pedestal base has disappeared entirely. It's been replaced by a foot ring without any piercings. Again, the full round form of the jar, a little bit of stamped or incised decoration, and then the accidental kiln gloss. Now, they also begin to do a lot of stamping. This coincidentally looks like a Paul Revere silver bowl. If there was any influence, it would be of this on Paul Revere, but in fact, it is more a relationship with Chinese silver of the 7th and 8th century. But what I wanted to emphasize, you got the circular bowl, you got a round foot ring without any piercings, but also notice the stamped decoration. Like I say, it's imitating a Chinese silver or gold bowl. This would be from the 7th to early 8th century, the way the base flares out, or the foot ring flares out, and the kind of stamped decoration. Now, in the Unified Silla period, we have for the first time the appearance of intentionally applied glazes. We don't find them often. The pieces are very rare, but they begin to appear. And this is a jar, covered jar from the Unified Silla period with stamped decoration and with an intentionally applied glaze that was put on before firing. Here is a detail. You see the glaze, you see the stamped decoration, and stamped decoration. We will see this again when we begin looking at the Koryō celadons. But remember, this began to happen in the late Unified Silla period in the 9th century. Now, in 918, we have the establishment of a new dynasty, the Koryō dynasty. This is regarded as one of the great classical dynasties of Korea, established in 918, and it continues until 1392. With China, with many of you are familiar with, it's contemporaneous with the Song and Yuan dynasties, a period of great refinement in literature, in painting, and certainly in ceramics when the celadons were produced. You'll recall that during the Three Kingdoms period, Silla's capital had been here to modern Gyeongju. That continued as the capital under Unified Silla, but with the establishment of Koryō, the capital moves to the north in this region here, right there, modern Chosun, which is just across the 38th parallel in modern North Korea. Seoul is here, which was a small city at the time. Pyongyang is up here, which was important as a sort of secondary capital. But the main capital was established at modern Chosun. Part of the desire was to move away from the old political, governmental, Buddhist establishment down in Gyeongju. So they established the new capital up there to start over, so to speak, with a new dynasty and free themselves from established traditions. Now, when I said this is the great period, Buddhism is still the state religion of Korea in the Koryō period, and there's still a great deal of state and royal patronage of the arts, for ceramics, for temples, for painting. And it's during the Koryō period, particularly in the 14th century, that we see some of these extraordinarily refined Buddhist paintings. Very few of these survive, only about 150 worldwide. Many are in Japan, a few in the United States, a few in Europe, a few in Korea. But it's typical of what we see here, with a very elegant presentation of the Buddhist deities, a lavish use of gold for the halos, for example, but even on the costumes. If you look through this wonderful white diaphanous veil, if you can see it up close, you'll find little gold designs worked into it. But look at the mastery of technique, where they're able to show the Bodhisattva's arm through the diaphanous veil. In fact, you look at the shoulder up here and you see that they're showing layer upon layer, extraordinarily well done. In addition to the Buddhist painting, of course, there are the wonderful Buddhist Sutras. Of course, these are produced in China, they're produced in Japan, but beautifully produced in Korea as well. It's indigo dyed paper. The text is done in silver. That is to say, it's powdered silver, which is mixed with glue and written on the surface with a brush. You can imagine how difficult this type of work is, of trying to brush precise characters with glue. But they do these magnificently in China, Korea, Japan. Now, often the text is in silver. Sometimes it will be in gold. But the frontispiece is usually in gold, as we see here. Once again, it's powdered gold mixed with glue and painted onto the surface. In many sutras of this type, instead of the Buddha looking directly out at you, the Buddha and his attendants are presented in three-quarter view, more or less looking at the text. And the reason for that, it's as if the Buddha is preaching the text that follows in the sutra. But this is very typical of the presentation in these Koryō, and particularly 14th and early 15th century sutras. The Koryō Sutra frontispieces, more so than those from China or Japan, there is a horror vacui, if you will. There is a desire to cover every inch of space. And so you have very elaborate designs with the Buddha, with the attendants, with worshipping deities in the sky, with clouds, with everything. But this is very typical, and that's a very, very beautiful one. So these are what we might say as the polarities for the Koryō dynasty. We will have a different set of polarities when we come to the Chosun dynasty, as I will show you. But it's one for elegance, extravagance, if you will, with the beautiful paintings, the use of gold and such, and then the very richly decorated celadons at their finest. So these two works really typify the taste of the Koryō period. As in the celadon. Now, what is celadon? Well, here's a definition of celadon. I will summarize it very briefly. Celadon, at the basic level, refers to a pale bluish-green glaze. At a more technical level, celadon refers to a glaze that is colored with an oxide of iron, just a little bit. You know, if you look at a piece of window glass, a broken piece, not through the window, when you look through the window, it looks completely clear and colorless. But if you see a piece of broken glass and turn it to the side, you know, there's just a little bit of green color to it. Never forget that glazes are closely related to glass. And so the glass in the window with that little bit of green is sort of like, not exactly the same, but sort of like a glaze. Now, for those of you who are old enough, like me, you might remember Coke bottle green. That's exactly the same thing. It has a little bit more iron oxide in it, and the right firing conditions, it will turn the pale green. Same thing happens with celadon. That is to say, the right firing conditions, the right temperature, but also the right conditions in the kiln. You don't want oxygen. You want the smoke from the kiln pushed into the firing chamber with carbon monoxide. With that, it can turn the very cool bluish-green color. With oxygen, it will be a more yellowish green color. So that's what we mean when we talk about celadon. To some extent, it's the color. To some extent, it's the firing. Now, keep in mind, one of the reasons I emphasize the stonewares from the Three Kingdoms and Unified Silla period is that the basic fabric of celadon ware is stoneware. If you can't already produce stoneware, you can't produce celadon. We weren't looking at low-fired earthenwares, but the celadon glaze is a high-fired glaze. If you can't already produce high-fired wares, you can't produce celadon wares. So this is why in China and Korea, these celadon wares became so sophisticated and so desirable because nobody else in the world could produce them. If you wanted them, wherever you were in the world, you had to get them from China and Korea. Again, a testament to the technological sophistication. Now, of course, many places by the Song Dynasty in China produced celadon glazed wares. The Celadon tradition was pioneered in this area, beginning about 2,000 years ago, about the time of Christ. They were not producing finished celadon wares. I'm saying that's when they begin to experiment with celadon-type glazes. It took many centuries for them to reach sophistication, and by the 10th century, in China, they were producing celadon wares of this type, often with incised decoration. The glaze often is a little bit grayish green, but this was the type of model that the Koreans were looking at when they began to make celadon wares. Now, you'll remember that the ceramics that we looked at from the Three Kingdoms period, those stonewares, were basically coming from Koryō, there in the southeast. The basic celadon kilns were over here in the southwest, not so far from the coast, mainly because that's where the best clays were. But in addition, I mean, the stoneware of this type had to be there as the basis. And some of the earliest celadon wares, earliest mature celadon wares were sort of skipping the developmental phase. But often those, say, from the 11th and beginning of the 12th century are plain and undecorated, as we see here, emphasizing the beauty of the form, the beauty of the glaze, rather than a particular decorative scheme. By the mid-12th century, of course, they're doing incised decoration. You have alternating branches of fruiting and flowering plants there. But also notice that they're sort of following in the Chinese footsteps of having vessels that imitate shapes in nature. So it imitates with its segmentation a melon, something like that. And then there were ones like this with carved decoration instead of just incised decoration. The difference being for an incised decoration, they will use a small pointed implement like a stylus. It might be compared to a pencil drawing, for example. With carved decoration, they're actually using a little scalpel, perhaps not metal, more likely bamboo, possibly wood. Now, this design at first glance looks a little bit improbable, a little bit hard to see, but if you look carefully, there is the tail of a phoenix in flight, completely entwined in a floral arabesque. But this is a design that comes out of textiles. And so when we think about ceramics, we realize there are relationships with metalwork, the gold, the silver that we saw before. Of course, there are relations with lacquer. There are relations with textiles in terms of where the shapes originate, where decorative schemes originate. This is one of the most exquisite celadon, Korean celadons that I know. In fact, it's one of the most exquisite celadons I know produced anywhere in the world. This is from someone who specializes in Chinese ceramics, so take note of what I said. And that brings me to another point. That is to say, at their finest, Korean ceramics vary a lot, but at their finest, the very best Korean celadons are every bit the technical and aesthetic equal of the very finest Chinese ceramics. One cannot say that about the ceramics of any other civilization. And so once again, putting Korea on the map, the ceramics do it, and they do it at the highest possible level. This has wonderful carved decoration, but just so beautifully done. This is the same one, just tipped up so you can really get a good view of the carved decoration there. Of course, that's a little bit of later damage, so just ignore that. But just an exquisite piece. They also went on to produce molded decoration, where they have a mold made of fired ceramic ware that they put in the center of the potter's wheel, and then using the potter's hands, push the clay against the mold. This is the same one looking into the interior of the bowl. It is a hibiscus, a blossoming hibiscus plant, with the flowers there, the star-shaped leaves encircling the walls of the bowl. Then this is a brush rest for the scholar's desk. If the artist is finished, the brushes simply can be put handle down into those openings. If the artist is alternating amongst brushes of various size, of course they can be laid lengthwise as one picks up a brush that's a little bit thinner, a little bit wider, that kind of thing. But now this is only about 5 inches in length, the very, very small piece. Absolutely exquisite. Now, I told you before, the Koreans have a particular taste for vessels and other items that have sculptural form. Look at this with those wonderful dragon heads at either end. But there is also a taste for open work. And you see that in the lotus arabesque right there. You can see it's hollow. You see right through it. And so this is one of the most marvelous works of Korean ceramics, particularly of Korean celadons. It's in the National Museum of Korea in Seoul, but one of my favorite Korean ceramics ever. Now, there are ones. These are in the Rockefeller collection here in New York. And looking at something like this, one realizes that the Koreans are imitating Chinese imperial ru ware, which was the finest ware produced for the Chinese court during the time of Emperor Huizong. This is one of the very famous pieces on the left in the National Palace Museum in Taipei, made for use by the Emperor Huizong and his court. This is one produced probably just a couple of decades later in Korea, imitating that. Of course, only a few pieces of ru-ware survive today, given the vagaries of war and things like that. But keep in mind, ru-ware was made for a very limited audience. It was not a commercially distributed ware. It was made exclusively for the palace. One wonders, how did the Koreans know about this? How could they be so up to date? Well, again, the exact answer is unknown. But remember, in the 11th, I always have some explanation, whether right or wrong. Now, whether or not I'm right, keep in mind that in the 1120s, the Chinese were the Northern Song period. They were facing invasions by the Jin Tartars. In fact, in 1127, the Jin Tartars would overrun North China. They would take over North China, and the legitimate Chinese court would flee to the south, country divided in half, and the new capital set up in Hangzhou. Now, why do I bring this up? It's to say that in 1121, China sent an embassy to Korea. There were no resident embassies then. Without telephones and fax and internet, there was no way to have a resident ambassador. So they would send embassies when they needed them. Why did they send an embassy in 1121? The Chinese were begging everyone for help. The Chinese had been paying bribes, if you will. We call it tribute, but they had been paying tribute to the Jin Tartars to try to keep them at bay. Finally, the demands from the Jin Tartars, they couldn't meet them anymore. And so they knew they were either going to collapse or they had to have military assistance. They were begging all their neighbors, all their friends, help us, help us, help us. You can imagine if the Emperor Huizong of China is begging for help, he's going to send silk, he's going to send gold, he's going to send ceramics that are for his exclusive use to get assistance from Korea. Korea assisted as best they can. North China still fell. That was that. But that probably explains that kind of close relationship between the Koreans, celadons in Ru style. Or ones like this with a very square shape. One of the most famous pieces in the Asian Art Museum of San Francisco comes right out of the Ru tradition. The reason for that, it's a ewer, it's not a teapot. They would have had either hot water for brewing, making tea in cups, or it might have had wine, something more akin to sake, that kind of thing, not a grape wine, that they wanted to have warm at the table, and so you heat the contents, and then you put hot water into the basin there to keep the contents warm at the table as long as possible. So beautiful as the square shape is, much of it would have been covered up when it rested in its basin, which again, the original Chinese example was made in Ruware with a basin that looks much like those Ruware bowls. And of course, the Koreans were doing magnificent work in silver as well. This example in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. But again, a ewer with the elaborate lotus top and the basin into which it would go. Now, towards the end of the 12th century, a little bit of background just to say that up until this time, Koreans were basically imitating Chinese decorative techniques, incising, carving, molding. But towards the end of the 12th century, they invented and perfected a new type of decoration, that is inlaid decoration. So you see here, this is an early piece decorated with inlay, and they're using it only in the border areas. The main decoration is incised, as you see there. But then they have stamped the decoration there, and they have filled the hollows of the stamped designs with black and white slips. A slip is a clay that's been ground to a fine powder and mixed with water. And then when that was all set, they covered it with the glaze and fired it. So instead of reading the designs as incised, molded, or carved designs, we read them as designs in contrasting colors. A technique the Koreans invented, perfected, and basically only the Koreans used, not the Chinese or the Japanese. This is one that's completely decorated with little chrysanthemum heads, if you will. If we ask, where did this type of decoration come from? Well, first of all, I mean, it might have been invented by the potters, but there could have been outside influences. Remember, they were already stamping decoration. Here we see it, and we see little florets that are not so different from what we found on that cuspidor. And so there was a tradition of stamping. There was also a well-developed tradition of inlaid lacquer, which had begun in China, which was imitated in Korea. That is black lacquer inset with mother of pearl. This is a beautiful Korean example from the 14th century. When you look at the little florets, you see how close they are to those on the ceramic piece. So whether there's influence from lacquer or whether it's just similar designs, we don't know, but there was a long tradition of stamping. Now, in addition to the inlaid pieces with small repeating stamp designs, there are ones that are pictorial, that ultimately take their inspiration from paintings on paper and silk. But more immediately, we have pieces with inlay decoration in silver. So this is a kundika, that is to say it's a Buddhist water vessel. They would put holy water in the vessel through there, and to dispense it, they would pour it out the spout there when needed. But in looking at the decoration, you see it's bronze, corroded bronze with the green, but there is the decoration of a willow tree at the water's edge, inlaid in silver, which is very, very similar to what we find in the Celadon ware here. So once again, there are kindred types of decoration in other wares. This is what a piece looks like without the inlay and without the glaze. Why it was fired without inlay, why it was fired without glaze, I don't know. We can blame it on the intern. We can blame it on the potter having a little too much to drink the night before. I don't know. But it was fired without inlay or glaze. The brown that you see is simply earth from burial. It's not part of the decoration, but that's what that kind of incised design looked like without its inlay. Now, in the early tradition of inlaid wares, there is a happy balance between decorated and undecorated areas. When I say early, I mean end of the 12th century, beginning of the 13th century, as you see with the wonderful crane designs. Or with this wonderful piece in the National Museum of Korea, with one bold peony on this side and a matching bold peony on the other side, but the sides, if you will, undecorated, except for the little molded handles with their lion heads. Or one like this, where again, very simple type of decoration, mostly undecorated. Now, when we move into the 13th century, we find a proliferation of decoration, so the majority of the vessel surface is decorated, as we see in this wonderful box here, a cosmetic box. Tip it up so you can see the design a little bit better, with the two cranes with their necks entwined, which is lots of fun. And there you can see the little florets there. When we look at those with the pictorial decoration, the ones that are a little bit earlier, you notice the shape changes a little bit over time, becomes a little more bulbous, but also the borders become ever more emphatic with the very large rising lotus petals. This is one of the great treasures of the Kansong Museum in Seoul. It's usually referred to as the 1,000 crane vase for obvious reasons. You have ascending cranes within the roundels, descending cranes in the interstices between the roundels, but the more sensuous shape and proliferation of decoration. There is also inlay that we refer to as reverse inlay, that gives a certain note of descriptive color. So that with the reverse inlay, it's the background that's inlaid in black slip, and the scrolling foliage pattern appears in green as if it were actual leaves. This one shows the technique as well, where it's painted decoration. And then we have a little bit of use of copper red. The Chinese used underglazed copper red at least 100 years before the Chinese. Whether the Koreans influenced the Chinese, whether it's coincidental, I don't know. No one knows. But the Koreans used it first. And when they used it, they often touched it on for descriptive color, like the little bit of copper red on the ends of the peony petals. Or you see it here, a ewer set in a basin again, a design of fruiting grapevines with little boys playing amidst the grapevines, but the grapes themselves are touched in with copper red, again, for descriptive color. Or this one, which is the Museum of Oriental Ceramics in Osaka, but there's a very similar one, it's just missing its cover, in the Freer Gallery in Washington, D.C. It is not an artichoke, it is a lotus bud that's preparing to open, and you can see that the petals are just taking on their color, the red color, before the blossom opens. And so an absolutely brilliant use of underglazed copper red, quite early, 12th, 13th century. Very occasionally, very rarely, they will produce a completely abstract design of just splattering the copper onto the piece, as we see here. Something that's rare in Korea and virtually unknown in China. So probably an experiment on the Korean side. And the last of the Koryå wares, really of the Celadon glazed wares, is of this type, where it's not a black glaze. They have covered the entire piece with a black slip. Remember, fine clay mixed with water. Then they have incised the way the black slip in those areas where the floral decoration is, touched in probably with a brush, white slip in those areas, a little bit of copper red. Then they've covered the whole thing with a celadon glaze. And the celadon glaze over the black slip makes it look as if it's glazed in black. But down here where the glaze is a little uneven, you sense that it's a celadon glaze. And then, as I mentioned, the Chinese had invented porcelain in the 8th or 9th century, already by the 11th and 12th centuries. The Koreans are learning to make porcelain. This is an example of Koryå porcelain. The shapes are very similar to celadon glazed wares. The melon-shaped ewer set in a basin again, but they're a little, because the celadon glaze is a little stronger, they look a little greener, if you will, than some of the related Chinese wares. Now we move into the last dynasty, the Chosun Dynasty, which extends from 1392 until 1910. Corresponds to the Ming and Qing dynasties in China. If this is the area of Koryō, during the Chosun Dynasty, Korea takes on the land area that it basically has today if you combine North and South Korea. The capital then moves from Kaesang, which had been the capital during Korea, to modern Seoul. So Seoul has been the capital as opposed to a subsidiary capital since about the late 14th century. Now, this is a very late Celadon piece, and you notice the shape has become quite exaggerated. The borders are very, very tall, and everything is covered with decoration. What I want to say, and when you see the progression of shapes from the earlier to the middle to the proliferation of decoration, the increase in the size of the border, you see very quickly and visually how that progresses. Now, in the beginning of the 15th century, with the establishment of the Chosun Dynasty, the old Celadon tradition basically dies away. It's replaced by porcelain, but the Celadon tradition lives on, if you will, in a ware that we refer to as Buncheong ware. It is a modern name. We don't know exactly what they called it. But you see, it's basically stoneware, gray stoneware, as you can sense there at the lip. It has been stamped with this kind of pattern, all over pattern. The stamped areas have been filled with white slip, and it's been covered with a very pale celadon glaze, as you can probably sense there, right where the bottom of the bowl meets the foot ring. And so this is, if you will, the Chosun Dynasty descendant of celadon ware, although they're made in different kilns. We're running a little behind, and so I'll just say that it's a gray stoneware that is decorated by manipulating slip, whether it's inlaid, whether it's painted on the surface, and then it's covered with a celadon type glaze. That's where the stonewares were produced, the unglazed stonewares. This is where the celadons were produced. The stonewares tended to be produced in this area, coincidentally sort of in between. The porcelains, which we'll get to very shortly, produced in many places, but the best ones not so far from Seoul, up in this area, where our Mr. Pak has his kilns there at Gwangju, not too far from Seoul. So you see how in some ways the background area has become the main decoration on something like this. And there how you see how it's stamped, and then the intaglio lines filled with white slip. Take something like this for others inlaid pieces, and already in the Koryō celadons, we saw the little chrysanthemum heads or florets were present in some of the late Unified Silla. They occur here, and what appears over here on some of the Buncheong ware, but the same kind of little stamped designs. It's just done more haphazardly. These are no longer the great wares produced for the court. These are basically becoming middle-class wares. There is a certain difference in aesthetic, but also they had to be produced more quickly, sold more cheaply, so a new type of design. But there you see the relationship and how it descends from that kind of thing in the Koryō ware. So some of them were stamped, others of them were, the design was carved, partially stamped, and it was inlaid, as you see here. The previous was inlaid, but with a very dramatic pictorial design. We think some of those probably were influenced by the decoration of lacquer, inlaid with mother of pearl. Then they moved away from all the stamping, which was so elaborate. Remember, efficiency of production is very important here. They would cover the entire piece with white slip. Then they would incise the decoration through the white slip or a little bit of carving there. So that you're seeing the gray stoneware body through those incised areas. Cover it with a thin coating of celadon glaze. There you go. Different from Chinese pieces, sometimes the front and back would be decorated very differently. The same technique, of course, but this is the back of that same piece. Excuse me, the front, the back. One with a star-shaped flower, one with a tiger, lion, a hete, you tell me what it is, but some kind of ferocious beast sitting there protecting the people who were using the vessel. But a real, and there you really get the feel that it is a celadon type of glaze being used on the Buncheong ware. And then particularly in the 16th century, they turned away from even carving and incising, which are very labor intensive, and moved to painted decoration, often a very quick, spontaneous, abstract type of painting. So that in this case, even the white ground has been painted on. You see the brushstrokes there. Once the white ground had dried and set, they painted the abstract floral motif, presumably, in a dark slip and coated it with Celadon glaze. Or there are ones that are painted with fish. These are some of the most popular of the Buncheong wares, typical of the late 15th, 16th century. Gray stoneware covered all over with white slip. They incise through the slip to create the border decoration, but then paint the fish decoration or other type of decoration in brown slip. And this is one of the cutest designs of all, where you have this wonderful bird that has just caught a fish, is grasping it with its claws, is flying over the rolling waves, somehow between these two giant lotus flowers. But it's an absolutely charming design done in Buncheong ware. So now I said, when we get to the royal type of porcelain, the most sophisticated ceramics of the Chosun period, I said that with these two, we had established a polarity that represents the Koryō period, the wonderful Buddhist paintings and the beautiful celadons. When we come to the Chosun Dynasty and we move away from the Buncheong wares, which were sort of a descendant from Koryō, these two become the polarity of the Chosun Dynasty. Buddhism was basically pushed aside. It didn't die out completely, but it was no longer had state patronage. And Neo-Confucianism, which had come to the fore in China and was the state philosophy of the Ming Dynasty in China, was espoused as the state philosophy of Korea. A very austere aesthetic with the kind of robe that we see here. And the most preferred ceramics at the royal court were not celadons, but were plain white wares that might have a pale blue glaze, as you see there. So you have one polarity. This is the other one for a change in dynasties. This, of course, is Koryō porcelain that we saw before, but this sets the stage. It must have been one of those things. Keep in mind, the Ming Dynasty was established in 1368, repudiating the Mongols, the Yuan dynasty, that kind of thing, a new dynasty with a Chinese family on the imperial throne. We have the establishment of the Forbidden City in Beijing and things like that. And also, it's during the Ming Dynasty, already in the late 14th century, that blue and white porcelain first becomes the most preferred ware at the imperial court. It must have been when the Yi dynasty, or the Chosun dynasty, the Yi family were rulers of the Chosun dynasty, it must be that when they came to the throne, the king had the feeling, first of all, they imitate China by establishing Neo-Confucianism as the state philosophy. But the king must have gone further and said, well, if the emperor of China has blue and white porcelain on his table, I want blue and white porcelain on my on my table, and I want it made in Korea. I don't want it imported. Well, the Koreans had already learned to make porcelain in the Koryō period, so it was just a matter of moving on to make porcelain. Okay, that was Koryō porcelain. This is from China in the 15th century, Ming Dynasty. That is from Korea in the 15th century. If you actually handle them, you can begin to sense some differences through connoisseurship and this and that. These are both color slides, by the way, but just in slides, you would be very hard-pressed to tell the Chinese from the Korean. Once again, attesting to the very high level of aesthetic and technological sophistication on the part of the Koreans. Now, the Chinese had a head start on producing blue and white ware. This is an example of Korean 15th century blue and white ware. This is the Chinese model on which it's based. The Chinese began to produce blue and white ware in the Yuan dynasty in the mid-14th century. The Koreans didn't really begin to produce blue and white ware until the 15th century. So here, the Chinese have already had many decades of development, and so you're at a very sophisticated level of painting. For someone who is just beginning, in a pictorial tradition, because the cobalt is not so easy to paint on the surface. You see that the Koreans have actually done a very good job with a very beautiful color. It's already a very, very pretty royal blue that you see there. But you also see the relationship, the source of inspiration. But Korean blue and white ware, 15th, 16th, even 17th century, is extraordinarily rare. It was probably produced in much more quantity than what we realize today, but because it wasn't collected as the Chinese ceramics were collected, but most importantly because of so many wars, so many invasions, things like that, most of it has disappeared. But that gives you an idea of what the early blue and white looked like. The blue and white ware in China, that is the imperial blue and white from the early 15th century, was produced up here at Jingdezhen in northeastern Jiangxi province. The Korean blue and white and porcelain largely was produced up there, not far from Seoul. But just to put things in perspective, but here there's Seoul, and many of the kilns were for porcelain were in that area right there. So pure white porcelain, sometimes it even has a pale blue glaze, as you see there. Many of the pieces were undecorated. Certainly some of them had blue and white decoration, but again, ones that meet the Korean aesthetic needs. Now, one thing we get, we find many Korean porcelains decorated with designs painted in underglaze iron brown. We don't find this in China. We find other ceramic wares, stonewares and such, decorated with painted in designs in underglaze iron brown slip. But Koreans sometimes would use iron brown for decorating porcelain, probably because the cobalt was rare, expensive, and not always easy to get. Again, unlike the Chinese, sometimes the Korean underglaze iron brown designs are highly pictorial. Other times they are whimsical. And once again, we have no idea what this represents. Looks something like a dog collar. We don't know what it represents. But these are very rare. But occasionally in Korea, you get this kind of seemingly whimsical design of a type that never, ever occurs in China. By contrast, you get ones like this that were produced obviously for the royal court that show a very close relationship with Korean painting of the day and that show the utmost sophistication in terms of painting. Now, there is a closer relationship between Chinese ink painting and between Korean ink painting and Korean ceramic decoration in the Chosun period, particularly 15th, 16th, 17th century, than there is in China. So you put these two together and you realize the closeness of how beautifully this is done compared to a roughly contemporaneous ink painting. It is believed that painters from the court academy probably went to the kilns that were producing the finest porcelains for the court. Maybe they did some of the painted designs. Certainly they would have taught the ceramic decorators how to paint designs like this, and they probably left behind copybooks as well, establishing that very close relationship. It's not just this piece. Look at this. This is one of the great marvels of Chosun period painting in underglaze iron brown. This is in the collection of the Ewha Women's University Museum, a national treasure, of course. It is a branch of fruiting grapevine. But notice how different this is from Chinese ceramics. First of all, the underglaze iron brown. But as I'll show you in a minute, the Chinese love their very elaborate formal borders. In addition, the Chinese probably would never decorate just the upper part of a pot. They would decorate the entire pot. This has no borders. It is a design covering just the shoulders of the pot. And in some ways, most amazingly, Chinese designs are virtually always symmetrical. This is asymmetrical, but balanced. Now, when I compare it with paintings, put these side by side, and suddenly you see this relationship between Korean painting and Korean porcelain, particularly 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. This painting would not have been the direct inspiration for the pot, but another painting like that one certainly was the inspiration for that. And so that point cannot be overemphasized. At the same time, it is too seldom made. And this, I was happy to find the inspiration for this in the San Diego Museum, where this was and where I saw it for the first time in December. They had no idea what was represented here. I quickly told them it is Kim Ung-won or Lee Ha-ung orchid painting. Put them side by side and you suddenly realize there's the rock, here are the leaves and of the orchid hanging down as you see there. And so even into the 19th century, there was this very close correspondence between ink painting and ceramic decoration, sometimes becoming extremely expressionistic, very abstract. And the back of this particular pot is completely undecorated in a way that the Chinese probably would never decorate one face of a pot and leave the rest of it undecorated. This is just to provide, of course, a contrast with Chinese ceramics where there are the elaborate borders. Every surface is decorated just for contrast. So you put them side by side and the contrast just jumps out. Both are masterpieces, but in the most different way imaginable. Of course, there was also an interest in underglazed copper red, which we had seen introduced in the Koryō period, used for little bits of descriptive detail. The Chinese used copper red as well. It makes a reappearance in porcelain decoration in the 18th and 19th centuries in particular, often with very bold designs that you see there, or this wonderful lotus plant there. Now, back to this Neo-Confucian aesthetic, very severe. By the way, in the West, we often think white is associated with death, mourning, this and that. Yes and no. There's a big difference. The white used in mourning, of course, is not white silk. It is unbleached muslin, scratch your skin kind of mourning kind of thing. This would be a scholar's robe, and it would be in white silk. And so hard to tell in a painting, but a big difference. But that sets the tone. For these white wares, the cobalt is introduced again. 17th begins to gain some proliferation in the 18th century. Again, with cobalt, the designs can be very delicate, no borders, just one sprig of bamboo that we see there. But also I wanted to show you that begin to have some of these kinds of things turning up in painting. This is a painting of a so-called spirit house, a hanging scroll, ink and colors on paper. And so you find this is a detail, you'll see it a little more clearly. An altar with a decorated tatami mat on the ground, if you will. But look at the things on the altar table. There's a censer, there are cups with offerings, there are stacks of fruit, there are melons, and here's a vase very similar to the one that we just saw, functioning as a vase. That type of ceramic piece probably sometimes functioned as a vase, other times it may have functioned as a wine bottle. But there you see one in a painting, a pair with a mate over there, actually in use. Put them side by side. This type with just a pale glaze, no decoration at all, was also very popular. Or there are ones like this, with a branch of blossoming plum. Again, would seem to be unique to ceramic decoration, but put those side by side. And even in the blue and white tradition, not just the iron brown tradition, you have a correspondence between paintings on paper and silk and porcelain decoration. Now, there are other wares which are less relationship with painting, but these 18th century jars are some of the great treasures of Korean blue and white ware. Again, they're often pictorial. This one with the crane alighting at night under pine trees with the moon up there. In the very best Korean blue and white wares, the cobalt blue is often a pale silvery blue, whereas in the Chinese tradition, it tends to be a deep royal blue, sometimes bordering on navy. This shows you a detail and gives a good sense of the painting, but also a good sense of the exact shade that the cobalt takes. The dragon jars, of course, also are popular. They also will have the borders will be a little bit stronger with the type of design down there and little stylized clouds around the top. But these very powerful striding dragons are made in the 18th century, of course, in the 19th century as well. There are ones that are more humorous, such as this wonderful one in the Museum of Oriental Ceramics, where you have a limited landscape, probably the moon up there, and this little mischievous-looking tiger prancing through the ground line at the bottom. Now, when we talk about these Korean porcelains, the Joseon period porcelains, they do not become extremely colorful. We have seen the brown and white wares, we've seen the blue and white wares. Here is one in which they also introduce underglaze copper, so that you have blue from cobalt, you have red from copper, and that sometimes they might introduce a little bit of brown with iron. But this is about as colorful as these wares become. Contrast it with a Chinese ware from the Ming Dynasty, this extreme interest in a very broad palette, a very bright palette. Now, this is very easy to do, these overglaze enamels. It's not that the Koreans couldn't do it, it was that very strong aesthetic for the plain, the simple, that Neo-Confucian taste for the white, and if you're not going to have white, at least make it subtle. Whereas the feeling, even in Neo-Confucian China, was quite different. In the 18th century, you would get something like that. In the 19th century, we're almost at the end, the decoration often becomes a little more abstract, some unusual combination of rhododendron leaves and peacock feathers, but you see the repeating design over the surface. Or sometimes they would give you, it's not a blue glaze per se. You can see brush strokes. They have painted the cobalt on to the surface of the raw porcelain, then they covered it with a clear glaze. Again, it's not that they couldn't produce a blue glaze, you simply mix the cobalt with the glaze. But apparently they liked the feel of the brushwork there, even though it's not representational. And again, they liked the sense of sculpture when it can be incorporated. So this is a brush pot for the scholar's desk, with the pine tree over here and the tiger rising up in low relief, the landscape elements enhanced with a touch of cobalt. Even the tiger's eyes have been picked out with little touches of underglaze iron brown. And then the taste for openwork reasserts itself. So you have a brush pot for the scholar's desk with these banana leaves crisscrossing to form the openwork patterns there. And then this is one of the most magnificent of all the brush pots. You have this wonderful dragon with blue eyes, blue mane, the openwork design, using this technique to perfection. Then there are pieces like this, very, very rare, but still showing this taste for solid grounds, but relief decoration, so that the molded decoration, the floral decoration, stands up in slight relief against a very dark copper red ground, or copper red again, with a faceted bottle, coincidentally looking something like a dreidel, but the auspicious elements of deer, cranes, lotuses, bamboo, and such rising in relief and with a clear glaze and set against a background tinted with underglazed copper red. Or here is one with underglazed copper blue, auspicious emblems again, but there is a taste for vessels of faceted shape, whether it's multifaceted like the previous one or simply vertical facets like this. And so those are the polarities. Koryō Dynasty over here, Chosun Dynasty over there, same thing, the polarity in the ceramics. For Chosōn, and this shows the different contrast in color between late China and late Korea. And just a couple more slides to take us into the 20th and 21st century. These are inspired by Buncheong ware. You know, the Chosōn descendant of the Celadon ware using the white slip. And so it's a stoneware body using white slip, but in a new and inventive way with a pale glaze. And this is by our master Pak Bu-wan. You see, it's like Buncheong ware with the stamped decoration, the stamped areas outfitted with white slip and then the glaze. But instead of having the gray body, you see it's a reddish-brown body. So it's a new interpretation of a very classic ware. This is also one of his bottles in a Buncheong manner, but decorated instead of with fish, for example. You have two birds sitting on branches in a blossoming tree, and then again, sort of brown ground. And of course, the white porcelain, the Koreans in the 18th century had produced the so-called moon jars. In the same way that Buncheong ware has been revived, if you will, in contemporary Korea as something uniquely Korean, so have the moon jars. Not that porcelain is uniquely Korean, but these large round jars, to some they're called moon jars, tal hangari in Korean, partly meaning that they're large and round like a full moon, but also because they're pure white, it's a little bit like radiant moonlight coming from the full moon. And because these are uniquely Korean, they're also popular today with a real Korean spirit about them. Another potter who also produces moon jars in white porcelain is Pak Young-suk, also active around Seoul. And then the last slide that I will show you is also Pak Young-suk. Remember, these white the porcelains that I'm showing you, these are color slides. It shows you how pure white the porcelain is. Pak Young-suk sometimes signs her pieces sometimes using Chinese characters, sometimes Korean Hangul, other times using a Roman alphabet. But this is the signature in underglazed cobalt blue on the underside of the piece. But that takes us to the 21st century, this one done in 2003. But it's a long tradition. You see that there are many continuities, this taste for sculptural form, taste for open work, but also once something is introduced, it doesn't give up easily. It persists, is revived, is reinvented, and reinterpreted. And that's one of the great hallmarks of the Korean tradition. And so I think we're there.